The film starts with an understudy named Margaret who works part-time at a cinema in the nights. At some point, during her standard shift, she meets a more established person named Robert, whom she sees as alluring. She rapidly fosters a squash on him and attempts to start up a discussion about films. Yet Robert doesn't appear to be intrigued and disregards her as he heads into the theater. Afterward, while Margaret is getting back around evening time, she fears somebody could go after her, so she refreshes her dearest companion Taylor about her area. After contacting her apartment, she out of nowhere runs over a canine external who is by all accounts deserted. Margaret understands that it will rain soon, so she chooses to take the canine with her. Yet, as they head inside, her proprietor spots them and advises her that pets are disallowed here, so she hesitantly sends the canine back outside into the downpour. The next night, Robert shows up to see the film once more, and Margaret endeavors to make casual banter with him. Yet he again doesn't answer as expected. Afterward, in the theater, Margaret stalks him, gazes at him, and envisions herself sitting and talking with him. After the film closes, Robert leaves the theater, however, before long has a shift in perspective and approaches Margaret. He then, at that point, requests her number, and she energetically gives it to him. Over the course of the following couple of days, the two keep on trading coquettish instant messages. Margaret likewise illuminates Taylor about this, who gets some information about the person's age. Margaret lies and claims that he is 25, however, as a general rule, he is a lot more seasoned than that. She likewise starts meandering aimlessly about how entertaining Robert is, and that he has two felines too, and that implies he is a mindful individual. Be that as it may, Taylor encourages Margaret to be careful and not to move excessively fast to keep up with command over their relationship. One night, Margaret is working alone in the school research center when she starts messaging Robert once more. She lets him know that she's eager, and he proposes they go out to eat. Albeit this energizes Margaret, she likewise feels that she scarcely knows the person. She chooses to meet him in her own particular manner and welcomes him to the lab, all things considered. Not long later, Robert appears there with her number 1 bites, making her truly cheerful. Subsequent to giving her the bite, Robert continues to leave, yet Margaret welcomes him inside and shows him the research facility. Margaret then, at that point, starts eating the tidbits, and there's a moronic insect imagines that bites are for it. Robert then chooses to check the extra space, while Margaret chooses to message Taylor that Robert was here, and kids about him potentially being a chronic executioner. After seeing the antiques, Robert turns out to be interested to the point that he gathers her to the extra space to get some information about them. Margaret goes along and begins discussing the antiquities when out of nowhere, the entryway closes all alone. She faults Robert when the entryway is locked, yet he says it must have locked itself. Right now, Robert abruptly starts attacking her in the extra space, yet it ends up being just Margaret's creative mind. Seeing her in trouble, Robert likewise becomes terrified and winds up breaking the entryway. This outcomes in huge harm to certain curios and obliterates an entire subterranean insect state. Soon after, an educator chastens Margaret and makes sense of how she really focused on this settlement for 17 long years, and Margaret obliterated it in a second. This leaves Margaret profoundly remorseful, however she can do just apologize. Outside, she expresses gratitude toward Robert for the bites, and apologizes for her response in the extra space. She specifies that she's leaving for her old neighborhood tomorrow for fall break, and recommends they continue messaging. They choose not to think about this experience their most memorable authority date. Prior to heading out in different directions, Margaret attempts to kiss him on the lips, however he simply kisses her on the temple, so she imagines that he should be a courteous fellow. The next day, Margaret heads to her old neighborhood to enjoy the excursion with her folks. During this time, she and Robert keep on trading texts and play with one another. Her folks likewise notice her adjustment of conduct and inquire as to whether she is dating somebody. Margaret then, at that point, enlightens them everything concerning Robert and notices that he is marginally more seasoned than her. Subsequently, Margaret's MOM lets her girl know that it's still too soon for her to get into committed relationships, particularly since she doesn't actually know Robert. One evening, Margaret chooses to assess things up and sends an enchanting picture to Robert, however he doesn't answer to her, causing her to feel humiliated. The following morning, Margaret claims that she didn't intend to send that image and apologizes. She leaves him loads of texts a short time later, however he actually doesn't answer, making her frenzy. While she is getting back from her old neighborhood, he at last texts her, making sense of that he was occupied working. Margaret then understands that she doesn't have the foggiest idea about his calling and envisions him working different kinds of positions. In the wake of getting back to grounds, Margaret tells Taylor everything, including how Robert has been keeping away from her since she sent him that image. Taylor chides her for being so frantic and cautions her to assume command over the circumstance. However, Margaret answers that she truly enjoys him and doesn't have any desire to mess around with him. All of a sudden, Robert unexpectedly texts Margaret and asks her out on a film date. Regardless of her companion's alerts, she energetically acknowledges his greeting. At night, Robert shows up to get Margaret and they get in his vehicle. Yet, coming, the entryway unexpectedly locks and out of nowhere gets stifled by Robert, which ends up being her creative mind once more. Afterward, they wind up watching Robert's #1 film, which Margaret sees as exhausting. Margaret observes desirously as couples sincerely share popcorn from a similar can and nestle. In the meantime, Robert is totally centered around watching the film and doesn't see Margaret's endeavors to draw nearer. After their kill-to-film date, Robert chooses to take her out for drinks. They go to a bar, where Margaret attempts to acquire passage with her ID. However, she is denied. Right now, she at last owns up to Robert that she is 20 years of age, and he is frantic in light of the fact that he expected she was somewhat more established. Margaret then starts to cry, figuring he will end things with her. Yet Robert doesn't care about her age, and gives her an enthusiastic kiss, all things considered. In spite of her bliss, Margaret is frustrated that a developed man can be a terrible smoocher, and she rapidly sorts out that he should be unpracticed. Following this, the two beverage a few brews, and in the bathroom, Margaret calls the companion. Taylor acknowledges from Margaret's voice that she's alcoholic and encourages her to call a taxi right away. However, Margaret has totally different plans. She and Robert then, at that point, choose to go to Robert's home. After arriving at there, Margaret starts searching for the felines he referenced, however oddly doesn't see them anyplace. Her creative mind out of nowhere begins roaming free once more. She imagines that Robert's home has a dungeon where he will hold her hostage. Taylor is additionally amazed that she returned home with him. Soon after, the two start making out. However, minutes after the fact, her adjust self-image requests that she stop this and take her from the house. Yet Margaret claims that the person is sweet when kissed her brow. At the point when they are going to begin, Margaret understands that she would rather not lay down with him. Yet, it's past the point of no return now. That's what she imagines, assuming she says no. It could set off Robert to hurt her. Margaret at last becomes close with him, which is far more detestable than the kiss. She understands that this is the most obviously terrible choice she's always made throughout everyday life. After they're finished, Margaret understands that this person isn't worth the effort, and she is to leave. She then asks him how old he is, and Robert answers 33. He inquires as to whether that is an issue, yet she guarantees him that it's completely fine. Robert thinks they were focused on one another as a result of their ordinary messaging, and something really earnest began between them when they rested together this evening. Margaret is the young lady of his fantasies. In any case, she feels choked subsequent to hearing this, and cases she should get back to her apartment. Robert is vexed. He figured Margaret would remain until morning, and he would make her morning meal. However, the young lady guarantees her flatmate would be stressed. Robert then drops her off in his vehicle. Yet during the ride, Robert is distraught at her while requesting to know why she loathes him. Be that as it may, it's Margaret's creative mind once more, and he securely drops her off at her quarters. Furthermore, when Margaret goes into her room, she gets a message from Robert. The following morning, Margaret trusts everything to Taylor and pronounces she would rather not see Robert once more. In the interim, Robert keeps on sending Margaret messages, so Taylor proposes impeding him on her telephone. However, Margaret believes it's excessively unforgiving. She likewise uncovers how he had no felines, and Taylor recommends that perhaps he lied about it to seem to be an innocuous and pleasant individual. Over the course of the day, Robert keeps on sending various messages to Margaret, yet she disregards them. She accepts this will possibly end when one of them passes on, and envisions him kicking the bucket in different ways. At night, she creates a long message about being occupied with her examinations to end the excursion, yet Taylor accepts it's excessively gentle. In the end, Taylor takes her telephone and messages him, "I'm not intrigued. Kindly quit messaging." Margaret believes it's a peace crawl and gets stressed. Yet Taylor consoles her that it's finished and prompts her not to worry about it.
Sometime later, Robert answers to her, saying he doesn't comprehend her since he thought they lived it up together.
Be that as it may, he actually regards her choice and requests that she get in touch with him on the off chance that she adjusts her perspective.
The young ladies are feeling better that it's at long last finished and Margaret can return to her previous life. The scene then, at that point, movements to days after the fact, when Margaret is at a CAF commending one of her companion's birthday events.
She is living it up until she sees Robert in a similar spot, drinking alone. Margaret would rather not face him, so she illuminates her companions about her circumstance, and rapidly escapes.
Afterward, she gets a text from Robert, guaranteeing that he saw her at the bar.
Robert then starts sending her steady messages, communicating the amount he misses her.
He asks what he fouled up to disturb her, or then again if perhaps he was excessively old for her.
Robert's disappointment before long transforms into animosity, and he starts mishandling her through instant messages. He even blames her for laying down with many folks, and he closes the maltreatment by calling her a prostitute. The next night, Margaret is working at the theatre when she abruptly sees Robert outside, after which he rapidly moves in his vehicle and drives away. Afterward, Margaret heads home alone, yet she feels like Robert is following her or sitting around idly. Sadly, her telephone battery before long passes on, and when Margot hears a motor, she gets back to the theatre and calls the police.
Margaret enlightens them regarding her relationship with Robert. She makes sense of how he sent her oppressive instant messages the previous evening, and today he was outside her working environment. Nonetheless, the official says that Robert hasn't actually violated any regulations by being outside the theatre, so they can't capture him on that premise. Margaret realizes that the police won't help her and she is completely all alone. Thus, she contacts Taylor, and the two head to a store to get a few instruments for her to protect herself. They likewise buy a GPS beacon and choose to introduce it in Robert's vehicle to watch his developments. Afterward, at home, the young ladies take a gander at the GPS beacon and can't help thinking about how they'll take care of business.
However, at that point, the companions get into a contention. Margaret could do without how Taylor makes a good attempt to control everything.
After a concise contention, Taylor stomps out of the room, passing on Margaret to introduce the GPS beacon all alone. In the following scene, Margaret rides her bicycle to Robert's home to establish the GPS beacon on his vehicle.
She enters Robert's carport and starts the mission. However, at that point, she runs over a canine, which is a similar one she found external her residence on the primary night she met Robert. Margaret is sickened as it at last occurs to her that Robert followed her that evening and has been fixated on her from that point forward. Minutes after the fact, Robert shows up at the carport and questions Margaret about her presence.
She blames him for following her and cases that she perceives his canine.
Robert basically asks what's in her grasp, and Margaret continues to utilize pepper shower in his eyes. Sadly, she gets overwhelmed and winds up splashing herself.
Margaret awakens inside Robert's home with consuming eyes, and he reprimands her for attempting to establish a GPS beacon in his vehicle.
Margaret demands that he let her go. However, that's what he asserts, assuming she gets out this way. He will be faulted for the circumstance and captured, regardless of what he says in such cases. Robert requests that she stand by until he thinks of an arrangement that would make him seem to be a culprit.
After this, he starts blaming her for embarrassing him as she was the person who moved toward him first.
Margaret additionally FLIs of the handle and blames him for following her.
Robert concedes that he followed her that evening, yet simply because he enjoyed her and needed to be aware of her.
He helps her to remember how she used to play with him in the cinema and make propose. Robert requests to understand what he fouled up and, on the off chance that she could have done without him, why she deceived him. Margaret answers that she loved him from the start. However, after that evening, she understood that they were various individuals.
The young lady then, at that point, demands water, yet he demands she really wants a legitimate saline arrangement. Hearing this, Margaret contemplates whether he's been splashed with pepper previously. Robert answers that it's really on the grounds that he's a medical caretaker and is familiar with these things. However, Margaret never tried to ask how he made ends meet. Here, Margaret again begs him to let her go. She won't inform anybody regarding this, and they can head out in a different direction. However, Robert has little to no faith in her. He then heads to the kitchen to get something to facilitate her stinging eyes. Making the most of this open door, Margaret attempts to leave. However, she sees the canine at the entryway and gets frightened. She then guilefully calls 911, yet Robert gets her in the demonstration.
Following this, a fierce battle results between them in the house. Margaret attempts to leave, yet he hauls her back into the house since everything would be over for him. At the point when he attempts to hold her hard, she tears into him. During the battle, a feline departures, and that implies Robert didn't lie about having felines, all things considered. They proceed to battle, and the two of them wind up tumbling down the cellar steps. Here, Margaret incidentally sets the room ablaze with a space warmer and causes a fire. The fire has impeded the entryway, and the windows are completely locked.
Luckily, Robert finds a protected spot, a channel chamber on the floor.
He gets inside and requests that Margaret accompany him, yet she declines.
Notwithstanding, she before long understands it's the main way she can make do and hesitantly moves into the unfinished plumbing space with him. The remainder of the house burns to the ground, and the police before long show up to douse the fire.
Taylor likewise appears, and after the firemen have quenched the blazes, they tell her that they didn't track down anybody in the house. Taylor requests that they check completely.
Luckily, sooner or later, the police declare that the two individuals have been found oblivious in the unfinished plumbing space, yet at the same time alive. Weeks after the fact, a completely recuperated Margaret rides her bicycle past Robert's old house with Taylor.
The two examine that Robert has moved to the coast in the wake of finding employment elsewhere at the clinic.
It turns out she hasn't revealed the occasions of that evening to anybody, so Taylor tells her she needs to hear the full story one day. In the last scene, Margaret is back working at the theater when a more established client starts up a discussion with her. He seems intrigued by her and requests her number. Yet before we see her reaction,